This is a continuation of lecture number 8 on World War II in the ABCs of Communism series. My name is Jason Smith. Now, when we finished last time, we had gotten through the Spanish Civil War and we'd gotten up to the point where the Hitlerites are going to attack the Soviet Union, and Stalin is doing his very best to delay that attack. Well, one of the things which is important militarily, which I didn't go over last time even though it happened in June 1937, is that in June of 1937, after the victories in Spain, and the situation is shaping up the way we have already described it in terms of the conspirators falling out and rearranging among themselves what their position is going to be vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Stalin has gone to the political bureau of the Central Committee and he's told them he wants General Tukhachevsky and others arrested and charged with treason. Now, the details of that have been provided to him by Czechoslovakian President Beneš, whose own secret service has come across a conspiracy which implicates Tukhachevsky in a plot to overthrow the Soviet government in a Bonapartist type of revolt. And the outcome of that political bureau meeting is that they unanimously agree with Stalin that the time's come when they're going to have to arrest Tukhachevsky and his whole gang. That happens on June 10th in 1937, and shortly thereafter Tukhachevsky and the rest of them are arrested and shot. That brings to an end a division of opinion within the Red Army about the kind of strategy that they're going to be following in the future, and it puts the entire matter pretty firmly on Stalin's shoulders to play out these last months of peace with Germany. Now, in 1939, Stalin does everything he can imagine to get the British and French to agree to a containment policy against Germany, but they refuse. They don't openly refuse, but what they do is Britain puts, for example, some low-ranking officers on a slow boat to Murmansk to discuss this matter with the Russians. And the French don't do anything at all. They don't really respond to this. So the answer is pretty clear. They have no interest in, will not get involved in a pact to contain Hitler. What does that leave Stalin? Well, it leaves him Germany. As much as he must dislike having to make a pact with Hitler, he really doesn't have a lot of choice, because if he doesn't, he's liable to get into a situation where he has to fight all these capitalist countries at the same time. And as a consequence, he directs Molotov to get in touch with Ribbentrop and tell him that they want to talk about a non-aggression treaty between those two countries. And that they do. So by the end of August of 1939, Russia and Germany have come to a new agreement. Now, you'll recall that they had done this originally in 1922 in the Apollo Treaty, that relationship with Germany of most favored nation status had lasted up till 1936, when Stalin finally cut off all of the oil shipments to the Third Reich. And so there was a precedent for German-Russian understanding, and that went right into effect. What this did was satisfy what Hitler wanted, which was not to have to fight on two fronts at the same time. So he now could worry less about what happened on the Russian front and more about what was happening with regard to getting England and France out of the war. Now, most of you know what happened was that the Hitlerites knocked the French out of the war altogether real quickly, and then they went after the British. So, but Russia at least had avoided war for the moment. So we know that this war is going to start on June 22nd, 1941. So Stalin's bought himself about a year and a half. Now, during that period of time, the Russians are stepping up everything they can in terms of getting their tanks produced and their planes and getting ready for war. They are jockeying on their frontiers for better positions, forcing certain concessions from the border fascist countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, and also against Finland. But now there is a German-Soviet frontier, which is in Poland, because when the Germans attacked Poland, shortly thereafter the Russians moved their forces up to the old Curzon line, and they have divided Poland in half. So that is the way this war is beginning to shape up on the Western Front. One of the things that we didn't talk about a great deal was what was happening inside Russia with regard to the collectivization as far as the farming people were concerned, how they had reacted to it. Well, overall the opposition had been pretty much removed from the countryside, so the reaction of the farmers was reasonably good. Now, it wasn't just because the kulaks had been physically removed and the middle peasants had been shocked into snapping to attention. It was also because the Russians had developed a system where anybody could write a letter to Comrade Stalin and get a response. All you had to do was write Comrade Stalin, Moscow on the envelope, and it would get there. Well, who got it? Well, there was a whole crew of people that were recruited. Eventually, they took the whole top of the building that Stalin used as his office, not in the Kremlin, but in another place there in town. And these were hundreds of men who went through these letters every day, and would send some agent out there to investigate what this abuse that this farmer was reporting that he received from his collective farm boss, what the reality was about the situation, and do something about it. So there were all kinds of trials being held on a regular basis in all of these villages of collective farm officers who had abused farmers. And if a farmer couldn't write the letter, all of these guys by this time had kids that had been to school and they were literate, and so they could write the letter for their parents. And these letters got a lot of attention. If there was something really bad being reported, it would be taken to Stalin directly. And this is the way that was being handled. Now, as far as army officers are concerned, one of the things that the capitalist press in this country has propagated for many decades is the idea that the Russians did poorly when the war started because Stalin had shot so many loyal, good army officers. But when on page 374, 375 of your textbook, I go through those actual details, and you'll see that this is just a complete lie. Nothing like this ever happened. And we can prove it with the same statistics that these guys have quoted that supposedly give us a different perspective. So at any rate, we went through the fact that Halifax had given Hitler a green light in November of 1937, and then after that, the international brigades were withdrawn. In September 30th, 1938, Hitler got Czechoslovakia from the British and French when Chamberlain signed it away. The Spanish decided that they were going to get out of the Russian alliance and throw themselves on the mercy of Britain and France, which was perfect because that allowed the Russians to exit. 6 weeks later, on November 15th of 1938, the Internationalists marched through Barcelona and they were gone. Now, that was the end of the opening shot for us of that particular war. Well, when the Germans come, the biggest problem for us is going to be that we have to secure our eastern frontier at the same time that we're fighting on the western frontier. What does that mean? Well, what it means is Stalin needs to know whether the Japanese are going to attack again out there in Mongolia or anywhere in Siberia, because this ties up a very large number of Red Army soldiers on a permanent basis guarding that frontier, which he would like to have available for the western frontier. In order to make that, but he doesn't dare move them out of there if the Japanese are going to attack at the same time the Hitlerites do. Well, he has an agent now in Tokyo. This agent's name is Victor Sorge. He is a man that Stalin runs personally. as he does Kim Philby and some of these others that Alexander Orlov recruited for him. He has educated Sorge to a certain degree himself, and he has overseen his movement into the Nazi SS, where he's now a lieutenant colonel by the time he is assigned to the German embassy in Tokyo. But of course his real job is to get as much information as he can about what this Japanese general staff is planning to do with regard to Siberia. And that's his ace in the hole, because Sorge has all of that information about the order of the battle of the Japanese army. What he's telling him is that the Japanese got beat so badly in Kalk and Gol at the end of 1930, at the end of August of 1939, when the rest of the world was looking at what Hitler was doing in Europe. They kind of missed the fact that the Japanese had taken a severe beating out there in Siberia and been forced out, but the Japanese haven't forgotten it, and they don't really want to go back in against the Red Army. They had such a bad experience the last time, they're not anxious to repeat it in 1941. Now, naturally, the Nazis would like them to attack in 1941. At the same time, they're attacking from the west, but the Japs are saying, nah, I don't think so. But what Stalin needs to know is for sure that they're not going to attack. So, Sorge's job is to find out just exactly what they plan on doing in 1941. And he does find out. So, he tells Stalin he's just been in meetings with the Japanese general staff talking about this specific question. And he says, no, they're not going to go. They've decided that they don't want to go through that experience again, and they will instead concentrate on what the Americans are doing. And we think they're looking at Pearl Harbor, but we know they're looking at other places where the Americans are giving them trouble, as well as the British and the French out there in places like Singapore. They're going to turn their attention south. They're not going back into Siberia just to help Hitler. So that is the information that Stalin absolutely has to have. As a consequence, when the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union develops, he's able to shift General Zhukov and his Siberian army out of Siberia and behind Moscow at just the right moment, so that the first defeat of the Germans in the entire war of any significance is going to occur to them as they drive on Moscow. And it's going to be a decisive defeat, which throws them back about 100 miles and is accomplished because of a battle plan. Now, this wasn't something Stalin put together at the last minute. During the 1930s, the Soviets had developed a military strategy called deep battle, and it was based on several textbooks, some of which we discussed in earlier lectures, that had been written on general foundations for the mobilization of the Soviet population in war and peace, that had been written by two men, and including General Frunze. Well, Frunze was gone, and now we have a new commander of the Red Army. But the important thing here is that we have an entire battle strategy that's been built up over a decade that anticipates two things. Either we strike first, in which case that's option A, the following things happen, or they strike us first, which is option B, and these are the things that are supposed to happen. Option B we call the neo-Napoleonic battle plan, because what it essentially is based upon is the idea that we're going to be confronted with a huge number of invading troops, and we're going to have to stall and retreat through some critical areas, but we'll put up as substantial a resistance as we can. Now, when this war actually starts on June 21st of 1941, the Germans attack with 3.5 million men, and an overwhelming local superiority in aircraft, tanks, and artillery. Everything you would expect, because the aggressor, of course, he has the opportunity to move first, so he's got everything he wants to have in place. The Red Army is afraid that this could happen, and they've been taking every step they could to prepare for it, but they get caught off guard too by the assault. Stalin later says he loses 1,800 planes in the very first day, blown up on the ground. Well, you have to remember that the Americans got caught in the same way at Pearl Harbor. The difference, of course, is the difference of scale, but on the other hand, Pearl Harbor was as important to the Americans as these forward bases were to the Russians. So it's a similar kind of situation. You kind of know they're coming, but in neither case were they adequately prepared for defense. But when Stalin gets it all together in a few days after this attack, he's talking to General Zhukov, who is one of his primary planners. He tells him the only good news about losing 1,800 planes in the first day is that these were all of our older planes. So all of the new ones that are coming out of the factories will be available to our Army very soon, and we didn't lose those at least. So these are some of the ways in which you could absorb the attack in a way that it was absorbed in practice. But the Neo-Napoleonic battle plan called for falling back to Moscow. They anticipated a several front drive, and it actually did develop. One wing going after Leningrad, one wing after Moscow, one wing after Stalingrad. Although that wing was initially heading south and not pointed at Stalingrad, headed further south toward the Caucasus. Army Group A, B, and C, they were called. So the Army Group moving against Moscow was the one that was confronted first by the Soviet counterattack plan. Now this involved getting Sorga's intelligence that yes, you could move. The Japs weren't coming after all for Siberia, so instead they were going to go after these other American bases. In fact, what this battle at Kursk and Goal had done was to make the Battle of Pearl Harbor inevitable, because it so burned up the Japanese idea of getting involved in Siberia that they now they have picked out the U.S. and Britain as the number one targets for them to destroy in their southern sphere of influence, and of course that's what they went after. So Pearl Harbor was made inevitable by the Red Army's success at Kursk and Goal. Now Stalin knows the good news is I can move 150,000 Siberian troops, and Zhukov says he can have them in front of Moscow, in front of the Urals behind Moscow in 6 weeks. So as the war develops, Stalin's moving his Siberian forces into place. Now this will give him a 2-to-1 attack superiority against Army Group B when he does decide to attack. So at the end of this first war, after 6 terrible months, the Russians counterattack and destroy the Nazi spearhead of Army Group B. And they have killed at this time at least 1 million Germans in terms of the time that they invaded. So, but the Germans came with 3.5 million men, so they still got 2.5 million out there under arms, and they have blockaded Leningrad, and they're moving south into the oil fields, and Stalin's ordered the oil fields to be blown up. And one interesting conversation, I met one time a Russian engineer, of course he was quite old, who told me that when he got the orders, he got them personally from Stalin to blow up the oil field. Stalin said, "Now, I don't want you to blow them up until you don't have any other choice. And if you do, you will be shot." So he said, "But on the other hand, if you don't blow them up, you will be shot." So he said timing to him was really critical, because his whole life was on the line about the whole matter. At any rate, they didn't actually have to blow up very many oil wells, because the Germans never quite got there. They got on top of one mountain in the Caucasus and raised a flag, and they did this, that, and the other, but they never really got their hands on those oil fields, which was what was going to be their next target in 1942. Well, so 1942 boils around. Now the war has been going on for about a year. The Germans are doing pretty much what the Russians anticipate they have. That is, they have given up for the moment on Army Group B moving against Moscow, and they've divided its forces. Some have gone north to help Army Group A against Leningrad. The others have gone south to help Army Group C complete its seizure of that area. But on its way south, the Russians do something which is pretty clever. They send out all kinds of radio information that they know is being intercepted by the Germans, which gives the Germans the impression that Stalingrad is unprotected altogether, that they could just dash right over there and seize Stalingrad, and then they would have the Volga River cut off, and they would pretty much have cut the country in half, and would be a death blow to the Red Army's war effort. So they see this shaping up, and they go for the bait, which turns out to be a terrible mistake. What had been happening back in Moscow is that the general staff, with Stalin, had been saying, "Boy, I wish we could get the Germans in another trap like the one we just almost closed against them outside of Moscow. But I don't think they're dumb enough to walk into another situation like that." And Stalin says, "Well, I can't make a decision on what the most intelligent thing they could do would be, because the most intelligent thing for them would not have been to attack us in the first place. But so we're going to have to look at what we might be able to get them to do. And what we might be able to get them to do is to take a look at Stalingrad. After all, it's named after me. And to Hitler, that's going to be a red flag. And if it's unprotected, as their intelligence is telling them it is, and it would be easy pickings, then maybe we can get them to come over there and do the same thing at Stalingrad that they tried to do at Moscow, in which case we could envelop them." Well, that's the way in practice, this modification of the neo-Napoleonic battle plan is now set to try to repeat the trap of Moscow against the Nazis at Stalingrad. And sure enough, they went for the bait. They go driving over there thinking that it's going to be an easy task, and instead it turns into being the end for them, because when they lose at Stalingrad, which they will, the actual loss there will begin in December of 1942, but it won't be completed until January. But when it is completed, the entire German 6th Army, which is heavily reinforced, and all of its satellites are going to be liquidated. In the very end, although many men were marched not from satellite armies, for example, the entire Spanish, they sent 2 divisions there to attack, not one of those Spaniards got back to Spain alive. And pretty much the same thing is true of the satellite troops from Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and every place else that the Nazis had been able to scrape together some forces. They didn't get back either. Of the Germans that were marched out of there, about 100 eventually made it back to Germany alive. So this German force was entirely liquidated. Plus, it lost at least a quarter of its entire material inventory. That is, of all of the tanks and planes and bullets and guns and leather goods and so on that travel with it, that an army has in its general storehouse, at least 25% of it was destroyed at Stalingrad. So that is what really happened at Stalingrad, and the Russians set up a trap for them. They walked into it, and by the time that pincers closed around them, it was too late. They tried to fight their way out, but they couldn't do it, and Hitler tried to send help to them from the other part of the army that had gone further south under a general named von Manstein, but he got stopped cold by Red Army tanks, and he couldn't get through. And so Paulus, the commander of the 6th Army, reinforced with all of that, had no choice but to keep pulling his men closer and closer into the town of Stalingrad. The Red Army just kept closing the circle on them, and the artillery kept pounding them. until finally they surrendered at the end of January of 1943. It's interesting because the war changes, therefore, from August of 1942 to January 43 completely on the Western Front of the Soviet Union. But for the United States it changed also, and for Japan, because at the end of August the Americans launched their attack on Guadalcanal, and by the end of 1942 they had won, and by 1943 the Japs finally decided to evacuate and give it up altogether. Now that was a terrible hard fight for the Americans through a whole series of battles, but they won it, and so the war changed for them right there. It was a terrible hard fight for the Russians at Stalingrad, leading up to Stalingrad, but they won it, and they won it right there on their own. Okay, so the next big thing that happens in World War II, as far as military events are concerned, will feature the full-scale introduction of Stalin's new tanks and planes. Now, the T-34 tanks, which I mentioned to you before, were a marvel of engineering that had been combat tested and developed through the Spanish Civil War. Well, all of the statistics on this are in your textbooks, so you could compare Panzers, for example, to T-34s. The Panzers never compared to T-34s, a far better weapon. But there are other comparisons that you'll use there. But the T-34 is best known probably for its slanted armor. What this meant was the front armor on a tank was slanted backwards. They had learned in Spain that shells will bounce off of that, and if they should penetrate, they have to penetrate twice as much steel when the armor is slanted. So you get more protection at half the weight. So these T-34s were extremely fast with excellent diesel engines. They probably lacked a lot in terms of comfort for the drivers, but you've got to remember that the boys that are getting into these tanks to drive them are coming right off of a farm in Russia someplace where easy life is not something that they're used to. And besides, they're 17, 18 years old. They're anxious to get out there and demonstrate their manhood and their patriotism and their loyalty. So they got into these T-34 tanks and they really made them run. These are tanks that could jump 70 feet, that had the ability to go real fast and pack a real wallop with their guns. So at the Battle of Kursk, the Battle of the Kursk salient, we have a big salient of the Red Army like this, meaning like a bulge in the line that leads from Leningrad all the way south to Stalingrad. Around Kursk, which is a town not too far southwest of Moscow, there's a big bulge that the Red Army has made progress into. The Germans are on both sides of it. Hitler decides that he could win this war if he could trap the Red Army in the Kursk salient, so he starts planning an attack which is carried out in the summer of 1943. And of course, you remember Stalin has one of the best spy organizations in the world, so he knows from his agents inside Germany, plus his agents inside the British intelligence service, who are providing him with information of what MI6 has decoded from their Ultra decoding system that some of you will have heard about. He's got all of this information, so the Red Army General Staff knows exactly what's coming against them, and they get ready for that. They get ready for it in such a way that when it does happen, a Nazi attack on this Kursk salient comes from the south and from the north. It doesn't make decent progress in either area, faces heavy Red Army counterattack, and then has to be withdrawn altogether. That's the last Nazi offensive of any significance on what they consider to be their Eastern Front, and the first of that summer's offensive by the Red Army, that is for 1943, which gradually knocks the Nazis halfway back to their starting point on the Russian border. Now, what Stalin now calls Operation Bagration, B-A-G-R-A-T-I-O-N, interesting name because it was the Bagration family that ruled Georgia for 1,000 years before the Tsars took it over, and they had only been firmly in power in Georgia for about a generation when Stalin's parents were married. But at any rate, that name Bagration comes from Georgian history. Now, Stalin names the counteroffensive of the entire Red Army for the rest of World War II Bagration, and its function is to drive German forces completely out of Soviet territory and eventually out of Eastern Europe and back into German frontiers where it will be finished off. Well, most military observers will agree with the statement that this is the most remarkable military campaign in the history of the world that we know about, because it worked. You're talking about an incredibly large conflict of huge forces, millions of men involved in both sides, and one side just steadily, firmly blowing the other one back, and in a very short period of time. Remember that it's only 2 years from the Battle of the Kursk salient before Berlin itself is going to be stormed. Less than 2 years. So within a year, Bagration has forced the Germans out of Russian territory altogether. By 1944, the Russians are on the move right through Eastern Europe. Now, what Winston Churchill has had nightmares about all of his life is that the Bolsheviks cannot be stopped. There's nothing that he can do to keep Stalin from taking over all of Eastern Europe. And he can't get the Americans to help him either, because they have no interest in fighting with the Red Army at a time when they still have a war to win against Germany and against Japan. So the odds, Churchill is confronted with the situation there. Now, there are 3 wartime conferences between the big 3. The ones that we hear the most about, the most important ones are Tehran and Yalta. Now, in both Tehran and Yalta, the Russians are winning the war, and FDR is very well aware of that, and therefore he is very concerned about his relationship with Churchill, because Churchill's always trying to get him into a compromising situation. If you want to know more about these conferences, let me suggest not only do you read the book, but that you watch the movie World War II, where Bob Hoskins stars as Churchill, John Lithgow stars as FDR, and Michael Caine stars as Stalin. So this is about the best movie I've ever seen that's been done in English, that is therefore by a capitalist production company, about what happened in World War II. But what we have on our side is we have the truth. So if you're going to make a truthful movie about the war, this is a movie that does that. And these actors, as you know, are excellent at carrying out their parts. So I'm going to leave that subject of the Tehran and Yalta conferences there for that time. Okay, what I want to move on to next is the way in which this war finally winds down. There are so many other things I could have could have talked to you about during this, that I have decided just to let you go ahead and read the textbook if you're interested in it. When this thing concludes, what you've got going is a strange situation where the Russians have now encircled Berlin, and they're attacking it from every direction. But Churchill is still trying to find a way to get into this thing before it's too late. And he's trying to get FDR to give him a hand, which means getting some Americans to perhaps do something, get in on this encirclement of Berlin. But Eisenhower doesn't want to get in on it. First of all, he knows that taking Berlin is going to cost a lot of lives. In the end, it cost the Russians about 250,000 lives. Eisenhower doesn't want to sacrifice his army to take Berlin when somebody else is willing to do it. And so the Americans are not going to be trapped by Churchill into making some kind of move into Berlin just for political reasons. And the war ends up pretty much with I go through some of these negotiations that are happening behind the scenes over all of this, but this is pretty much the way it ends up. The Russians storm the last Nazi citadels, and they bring about an end of the Nazi regime, and by May 1st they've done what Stalin wanted them to do, and that is put the red flag on top of the bombed out Reichstag building, which is symbolic of the victory of world communism against world fascism. This role of the Comintern is still very important. When Moscow itself was under attack from the Hitlerites to begin with, it was George Dimitrov that stood atop Lenin's tomb with Stalin and addressed the Red Army as they went off to fight. So this is the symbolism that Stalin had carried with him through this entire war, and they call it the Great Patriotic War because it was a war that everybody that was Russian should get involved in to support the Red Army. But at the same time, they saw it very clearly as a war between communism and Nazism. So both of these threads were satisfied by the May victory in 1941 in Germany. Now what we have almost immediately setting in is the Churchill begins to try and draw a line against Stalin's forces of some kind. And he's made various attempts. He even went to Moscow once to make a deal personally with Stalin about who was going to have the most interest in what countries. What he indicated at that time was that Britain wanted to have a nearly 100% interest in what happened in Greece, but he was willing to give 100% interest to what happened to Russia, to what happened in Bulgaria and Romania. So Churchill was sitting there drawing percentages on a piece of paper, Stalin smoking his pipe and watching him, because, you know, fundamentally this doesn't mean anything. What's going to happen is whoever has their troops on the ground, wherever they are, has the ability to determine what's going to happen. And now if he wants to be a nice guy and try and get along with Churchill, which he really doesn't want to do if he doesn't have to, he could always say, okay, you can have the most say in Greece because we know that's important to you, and we'll have the most say in Poland because that's important to us. Churchill saying, well, you know, we went to war over Poland, that was the reason we got involved. I don't know whether I could go along with that completely, but on the other hand, it's the Red Army that occupies Poland, so what are you going to do about it? Same issue had come up with FDR when he told Stalin at Yalta, you know, this is the Polish matter is important to us because we have several million Polish people in the United States as citizens. Stalin had said, yes, you do, but only 6,000 of them vote. I know because I looked it up. So FDR didn't even respond to that because it never occurred to him that Stalin would be familiar with machine politics in the United States. But at any rate, Stalin's making it clear to everybody that, but he says, but on the other hand, Poles are not fit for communism. I don't mind it if you have a capitalist government there. But the truth of the matter is that the Poles that are going to set up the government in Poland are the Moscow Poles, the ones that have been living in Moscow, and they're going to come back and set up a red regime. And there's nothing that the British or Americans can do about that, even if they wanted to. Well, maybe they want to, but there's nothing they can do about it. So the post-war part of this whole thing has already been settled by the military realities of the way the war ended. Now, that doesn't stop the British reactionaries from deciding that they want to try and create a new war against Russia. And they are often, from the moment that the red flag is raised over the Reichstag in Berlin, Churchill and his gang have now seen Stalin as the number one enemy. Well, you'll recall that FDR died just a few weeks before the defeat of Germany, so we have a new president in the United States, Harry Truman. Now, I don't know whether the world really was ready for what Truman represented, but looking back on it, it's pretty clear that this was a tremendous advantage for the illegal elements of the American capitalist class, because for many, many decades, Truman had been supported in Missouri as a judge and then later as a politician by Meyer Lansky's affiliate there that was run by a man named Pendergast, I believe. And putting Truman into the presidency had been something that was not entirely accidental. In other words, when he was picked to be vice president for Roosevelt's fourth term back in 1944 to run in the vice presidential spot, they had to remove Henry Wallace. Well, Henry Wallace was a very progressive guy out of Iowa who was very friendly to the Soviet Union. Now, getting rid of him at the time probably wasn't that hard, but no one could have, well, very few people could foresee the consequences because Roosevelt was so sick, something that was kept a secret from just about everybody, that when his fourth term began, he didn't have very long to run. By the time 1945 was around, he was close to being dead. When he died, Truman, who was a young man with this organized crime background, now becomes president, and within a matter of 2 weeks, one expert on this matter wrote a book called The Cold War and Its Origins. He says that Truman managed to reverse FDR's entire foreign policy within 2 weeks. Well, that might be roughly accurate. So what did he reverse it to? Well, FDR had been very anti-imperialist as far as British and French activities in Indochina, for example, and around the world were concerned. He said the United States is not going to get involved in restoring French colonialism in Indochina, for example. And one of the consequences of that, of Truman's reversal of that, was that now the French could expect to get support from the United States when they tried to re-invade Vietnam. So that they did re-invade Vietnam, they did get U.S. support, and this was one of the immediate reactions to the whole thing, to the U.S. change in foreign policy. Foreign policy changed in Latin America too. The Americans had gotten used to working with communists in Latin America because of the unity that the communists proposed in the labor movement, what they proposed to do, what they did do in many countries in South America and Mexico South, was get organized labor to call off any strikes in favor of organizing production. In other words, they said, we'll make that sacrifice, even though the capitalists should make it right along with us. If they don't, we'll make it anyway. You won't have to worry about strikes in any industry that could affect the war effort. So this had been very well received in Washington, and they'd gotten used to working with these communists. Well, as soon as the Truman administration took over, all of that started to change. And we began to, the military intelligence, which had been running everything intelligence-wise, now began to change. So you had OSS and military intelligence were gradually being moved into a new organization called the Central Intelligence Agency. By 1948, that was accomplished. And the shock troops for changing the situation in Latin America were there. But when you take a close look at the post-war history, that is immediately after the end of the war in Germany, you'll see that in all of these South American countries, the American embassy began to take a more hostile policy toward progressive forces, including the communists in those countries. Well, that's another thing that we're going to get to here in a coming lecture. Before we finish this series, I'm going to go through every one of the South American countries, because they're going to be each have a chapter in the 2015 edition of the ABCs of Communism. So in your textbook, you're going to see detailed discussions of all of the events which occurred during the course of the war, which I've only touched upon here. But for an overview, what you have is this. The war starts for us in Spain. The way things work out there is that we're able not to get engaged in that as far as the major capitalist countries are concerned at that time, and which is fine, because we have two fronts already, the one in Siberia and the one here on the western front of the Soviet Union, and we don't need a third one in Spain that we can't supply anyway. And So getting out of that mess in Spain was useful for us. Besides, we had no choice. So the next step for us was getting ready for the attack on our frontiers. Well, that came first against us had come first against us in the fall of 1939. At the same time Hitler was challenging the western frontiers, the Japanese attacked us at Khalkhin Gol in Siberia, Mongolia, and there they got seriously whipped, and they were not ever going to come back into that war. As it turned out, in 1941, when Hitler broke the non-aggression treaty and attacked the Soviet Union, they could not be convinced by the Nazis to come back in. And I explained some straightforward battle. The Nazis were almost trapped and wiped out at Moscow, but instead they were trapped, but they got out of the trap and they took serious losses, so serious that Army Group B never really recovered. Now, then they kept going and decided to try it again against Stalingrad with Army Group C, or at least a big part of it, and they walked into another trap. And there, this time, they did get completely liquidated and could not be rescued, and the ramifications for their army were that they were finished. They had 6 more months before they were defeated. And when they got defeated at Kursk, it was the end of for them. From then on, it was just a year or two. And they were pushed all the way back to the gates of Warsaw in the gates of Berlin in less than 2 years. And there, of course, Berlin was stormed. They took the losses that were involved. The Americans stood aside because Eisenhower did not want those kind of losses, nor did Roosevelt. And the British didn't even have the force to get involved in something like that. So that is the way World War II can be summarized from a Bolshevik standpoint. So having said that, I'm going to wind up this lecture number 8B, and we're going to get ready to talk about what happened in the immediate post-war period as the Cold War kicks off under the leadership of the new Truman Gang that has taken over, which, by the way, is another way of saying that organized crime is taking over the U.S. government. So that from then and through the assassination of JFK, they are going to be one of the major players. That is, the illegal element of the U.S. capitalist class is going to be one of the major players in determining U.S. policy. It won't be until after they are defeated in Vietnam definitively by the Vietnamese that the U.S. ruling class begins to say, we've had enough of the mafiosos running things, we're going to start running them ourselves. And then they did pretty much put an end to their alliance with Meyer-Lansky and his group, who by this time were pretty old men anyway, and they began to run things the way they have been up until now. And you can see what a mess they've made out of their economy now.